Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 91. Things kick off. Before we get into the episode, a shout out to our most recent supporters, Parp on Patreon and Konri on Ko-fi. We really appreciate anything people can give, and it helps us pay for the incidentals and hosting and keeping this going, so thank you so very, very much. More on how you can donate at the end of this episode. Also, quick content warning. We are talking about ancient war and violence, and that includes harm to others and self harm. Unfortunately, the past was often a violent place. So, in this episode, we are dealing with events that are happening in the late 6th century. In fact, we're dealing with a narrow but important slice of the 6th century that is happening largely in the period after the death of Nunakura Futodamashiki, aka Bidatsu Tenno, in about 585. Tensions were high, and to say that there are some scores to be settled among the Yamato elite is putting it lightly. The Soga family themselves were ascendant, with two branches of the royal family descended from the daughters of Soga no Iname, and Soga no Umiko was running the family as Omi, one of the top court officials in Yamato. On the outs were the Mononobe, especially Mononobe no Moriya. As we discussed last episode, Moriya had been having a fairly successful time of it. He had defended the worship of the kami against the encroaching religion of Buddhism, and he had recently taken down Miwa no Kimi no Sakai for insulting Prince Hasetsukabe Anahobe at the Palace of Interment. But then, when Tachibana no Toyoi, aka Yomei Tenno, asked to worship the three precious things of Buddhism, Moriya suddenly found himself in the minority. Moriya continued to push that same line, to avoid angering the kami by worshiping this new religion. This time, however, even Prince Anahobe was against him, bringing his half-brother, a Buddhist priest, so that he could pray in the Buddhist fashion. Moriya suddenly found himself a political outsider, and he retired to his home base in Ato on the Kawachi Plain before someone decided that he himself was an enemy of the state. He was egged on in this by those like Oshisakabe no Kekuso, who whispered in his ear that all the rest of the court was against Moriya. As such, Moriya didn't just retire, he built up an army around himself to keep him safe should his political rivals come for him. And it wasn't just the Mononobe forces that came to support him. His good friend Nakatomi no Katsumi was there as well, bringing his own forces to help support those that Moriya had already assembled. Katsumi also brought all of the spiritual power that he had apparently possessed. And wait, what? Spiritual power? Just who was Nakatomi no Katsumi, and why does he even matter for any of this? Was he really the only one who came to Moriya's side? Or is he included because the chroniclers knew that his family were important to the 8th century, and so they were making sure to mention Nakatomi even when they may have overlooked others? It's kind of hard to say. So let's start with looking at the Nakatomi and their relationship with the Mononobe in general. We know that the Nakatomi were a court family, and they held a position as court ritualists. In later years, they would be known for conducting the O Harai, or Great Cleansing ritual for the court, among other things. Their name would seem to come from their courtly position, something like Nakatsu Omi, or the Minister of the Middle. That said, none of the Nakatomi so far have been mentioned on the same level as the Oomi or O-Muraji. They do have the Kabane of Muraji, putting them on equal footing with the Mononobe, although they may have picked that up sometime after this period. It's really kind of hard to say with these things. And we know why the Nakatomi were so important to the chroniclers. After all, they would go on to become a powerful court family. Later, they would go on to give birth to Nakatomi no Kamatari, the progenitor of the Fujiwara family, who would go on to dominate court politics. So the chroniclers were very invested in the Nakatomi/Fujiwara story. Heck, early on in the Age of the Gods, we already had figures like Ame no Koyane, the purported kami ancestor of the Nakatomi clan, who was closely involved with the Amaterasu myth cycle, particularly with the story of the Heavenly Rock Cave. That story may have been added later, of course. There are other versions in the Nihon Shoki where Koyane is not quite as prevalent. Also, it's possible that the ancestral connection was made at a much later date as well. Still, by the 8th century, there was no real dispute about how closely the Nakatomi were tied to the court and the sovereigns. Despite that, the current dynasty is really the first we see very much of them, as at least as far as I can tell. I mean, there's a mention of Nakaomi earlier in the text, but the way they are described with a separate family name suggests they were actually just a middle minister, possibly reflecting something of the later positions of minister of the left, minister of the right, and a minister of the middle. Or perhaps this was the position from which the name Nakatomi was originally derived. It isn't really clear, and there's no definitive line we can draw from that early use of the term to the present, not that I've seen anyway. So, the first real appearance of the Nakatomi seems to be at this moment in the courtly political fights over Buddhism, with the Nakatomi siding with the Mononobe against the arrival of Buddhism. Once again, this would make sense as court ritualists invested in the existing order and the belief system, but also would make sense in terms of later conflicts with the Nakatomi and the Soga clan as well. All of which leads me to wonder about how much the Nakatomi were actually involved in assisting the Mononobe at all, but purely based on the narrative left to us in the Nihon Shoki, they did seem to have a significant, if somewhat minor, role. You see, as Moriya had retired and withdrawn into his familial stronghold in the Kawachi area outside the Nara Basin, Nakatomi no Katsumi raised forces of his own and went to support his ally. However, the aid that Katsumi offered was more than just physical. He intended to make use of his family's role as ritual specialist, since the ability to have the kami lend aid and support apparently could work for both good or ill. And so he prepared images of Hikobito no Miko, the heir apparent, as well as Takeda no Miko, and tried to place a curse on the two of them. And while this all feels like something out of an Onmyoji movie, something with fire, chanting, and not a few nails driven into some kind of image or effigy, the details on the ground are pretty thin. Still, it's extremely interesting just whom Katsumi was going after, and their relationship to everything, especially given the rest of the narrative. First, targeting Prince Takeda seems somewhat obvious. He was one of two sons of Toyomike no Kashikiya Hime and Nunakura no Ookimi, aka Biratsu Tenno, the last clear sovereign based on the way succession had been seemingly working so far. With Kashikiya Hime a Soga descendant and a niece of Soga no Umako, I can easily see why Takeda might make the hit list. It's interesting that Ohari no Miko, her other son by Nunakura, isn't also mentioned. Perhaps he had already passed away, or just was not considered a contender for the throne for some reason. On the other hand, Hikobito, aka Hikobito no Ohine, was the son of Nunakura and his first queen, Hirohime. That made him only the stepson of Kashikiya Hime, Nunakura's second wife. This all means that Hikobito was perhaps the last royal prince with a reasonable claim to the throne that was not actually connected by blood to the Soga family. If anything, with the Mononobe and Soga feuding, one would think that a non-Soga heir like Hikobito would actually be a good thing for Mononobe and their allies. So, why was he being targeted? It's possible that he was considered too close to his stepmother given the rest of the family had passed away. However, the most likely answer that I can see is that as the heir apparent, he stood in the way of Mononobe's own personal choice to the throne, none other than Hasetsukabe Anahobe no Miko. Yeah, despite the fact that he had supported his stepbrother's request and brought in a Buddhist monk to pray for him, Anahobe still appears to have been quite close to the Mononobe, and as such, they likely preferred someone like him to the unknown element of Hikobito, on whom the chronicles have been relatively silent. Unfortunately for Nakatomi no Katsumi, all of his chanting and ritual power appears to have been for naught. Apparently, people don't just drop dead because you ask the spirits nicely to take care of some troublesome prince. And so Katsumi decided there was nothing else for it. He would have to carry out the deed himself. And so he made his way to Hikobito's residence in Mimata, and there he presumably slew the prince, once again opening the line of succession. Katsumi's heinous deed would not go unanswered, however. No doubt he was planning to hit the residence of Takeda no Miko next, but he wouldn't get that far. As he was exiting the mansion of Hikobito no Ohine, Katsumi was seen by one of the attendants, or toneri, named Tomino Obito no Ichi, who drew out his own sword and slew Katsumi on the spot. No doubt this threw things into chaos. Katsumi, a known ally of Mononobe no Moriya, had killed the crown prince and appeared prepared to do more had he not met his own end in the process. We are told that Moriya quickly sent a message by several trusted individuals to Sogano Umako, claiming that, as he still believed that people were out to get him, he was just staying out of everything for the time being. This promise, however, rang hollow, and we're told that Sogano Umako sent his own messenger to Otomo no Hirafu no Muraji, letting him know everything that was going on and apparently requesting the Otomo's assistance. Next thing you know, Hirafu is showing up at Umako's place with a bow and arrows and a leather shield, and apparently setting up his role as one of the first Yojimbo or bodyguard, sticking to Umako like Kevin Costner to Whitney Houston, though perhaps with slightly less romantic context. But you never know. And if there are people out there writing Asuka-era political fanfic, well, there you go. Have fun with that. A quick side note, just because it's a neat detail. This mention of a leather shield corresponds with some actual finds in tombs from around this era. While metal and even wooden shields have survived, the leather shields were not as durable, but archaeologists have found frames with remnants of paint, indicating something similar. I'll have some links on the podcast blog page for any of those who are interested. All of this was happening as Tachibana Toyoi, aka Yomei Tenno, was getting worse and worse. Despite worshipping the three treasures of Buddhism, his disease continued to take its toll. Eventually, Kuratsukuri Be no Tasuna, a son of Shiba Tato who had helped Umako to build a temple during Nunakura's reign, and who had even had his own daughter ordained as the first nun, offered to build a 16-foot tall Buddha statue and a temple with a pagoda, and even to become a monk on Toyoi's behalf. Alas, it was to no avail, and Toyoi found his life canceled all too soon, like a space cowboy epic on Fox. The statue, though, along with its attendant bodhisattvas, was still around in the 8th century at the temple of Sakata in Minabuchi, which was likely situated in the Asuka area at the time. Whether or not Toyoi was actually a sovereign, or if this is a polite fiction designed to further bolster the claims of his son, Prince Umayado, eventually known as Crown Prince Shotoku, that isn't really clear to me. We discussed this possibility last episode, but according to the narrative we have, this meant that there was now a clear path to a vacant throne. Not only was Toyoi no longer occupying it, but Nakatomi no Katsumi had taken out the prince with perhaps the strongest claim to it of all the remaining princes. Prince Takeda was still out there, as were the previous generation, including Anahobe and Hasebe. All of them were Soga descendants, but politics often makes strange bedfellows. Mononobe no Moriya, for all of his beef with Soga no Umako, was apparently close friends with Prince Anahobe, and with the throne empty, Moriya seems to have decided that it would be nice to have a friendly face there. As you may recall from last episode, Anahobe had already demonstrated himself to be ambitious. He had tried to take Kashikiya Hime and make her his wife, no doubt to cement his own place as a contender to the throne. When Sakai no Kimi resisted Anahobe's attempts to force himself on her and on the court, Anahobe enlisted Moriya in having Sakai no Kimi killed. Now, after the death of Toyoi, we are told that Moriya's personal army was, quote-unquote, making disturbances, a polite euphemism likely meaning he was taking out potential rivals, although apparently not in a way that unified the rest of the court against him. Not yet. Probably meaning that he concocted some excuse or another for whatever had happened. But he was going to need to do more to feel safe again, and that safety lay in getting Hasetsukabe Anahobe onto the throne. To do that, though, they needed to coordinate. And so Mononobe no Moriya crafted a secret message to Anahobe, suggesting that they go hunting together over on Awaji Island. Hunting was a common enough activity for the court nobles of this era, and Awaji Island was across the water, well away from prying ears. There, Moriya and Anahobe could craft their plans to put Anahobe on the throne. As they say, however, loose lips sink ships, and in this case, the ship that was sunk was the one forming between Moriya and Anahobe. Word got to Sogano Umako about just what Moriya was attempting to do, and he immediately took it up with Kashikiya Hime. Word of the attempted collaboration was as good as proof, and together the queen and her uncle commissioned 3 men and their forces to go and unalive Prince Anahobe, as well as another prince known to be sympathetic to his cause, Yakabe no Miko. The takedown of Anahobe reads like something that would fit in well in a Hollywood blockbuster. The 3 men gathered their forces and headed to Anahobe's residence, which was apparently at least 2 stories tall, as they chased Anahobe through the house until they cornered him on the 2nd-story balcony. There, one of the attackers lashed out on Anahobe, catching him on the shoulder, with what I can only imagine as a Wilhelm scream. Anahobe went over the railing and fell to the ground. As his assailants headed back to the ground floor, Anahobe dragged himself over to the outhouse and hid himself in the dark inside. His assailants were thorough, however. Holding up their torches, they were able to find Anahobe's hiding place. And so, instead of sitting on one throne, he died in another. Either way, Moriya was now in a real pickle. If the ministers weren't out to get him before, they definitely were now, and his presumed royal patrons were both permanently unavailable. And so Mononobe no Moriya gathered his men to his house in Shibukawa, where they fortified themselves against outside attack. Here we can really see the bias of the chroniclers coming through. On the side of the pro-Soga forces, led by Kashikiya Hime and Sogano Umako, you have numerous named individuals, including 5 royal princes and numerous noble families, many of which we've heard about previously. There were the Ki, the Kosei, the Kashiwade, the Katsuragi. Later, we're told of the Kasuga, the Sakamoto, the Heguri, the Abe, and even the Otomo. They were all of Omi or Muraji rank. Meanwhile, on the other side were the Mononobe, defending with the men of his house, that is to say, the warriors that made the Mononobe family what it was, and what the chronicles call a slave army. Of course, the chronicler's own biases are likely dripping through the pages here based on the way things were going. Only Nakatomi no Katsumi was mentioned helping Mononobe no Moriya, and after he exits the stage, the Nakatomi seem mysteriously absent from the roles on either side, especially as a later note makes reference to men of rank amongst Moriya's troops. Then there's the note that the Mononobe forces were buoyed by enslaved soldiers, though for some reason I highly doubt that they were the only ones using such forces, and that may have just been a dig at Moriya and his army. Whatever the chroniclers thought of them, they were still quite formidable soldiers. It wasn't for nothing that the Mononobe were the court's goons whenever they needed a little bit of that ultra-violence enacted on someone. On top of that, they had time to fortify their position, creating their own inaki or rice fort from which to fight. Even Moriya himself joined in the fighting, climbing into the fork of a tree where he rained down arrows like Legolas at Helm's Deep. The Mononobe repulsed the pro-Soga forces at least 3 times, and it wasn't looking great for Umako and all his men. In the rear of the train was the young Prince Umayado, and even he could tell things weren't going well. We know that Umayado was considered particularly precocious, and the chroniclers also tell us that he had his hair tied up on the temples, as was the custom for boys of about 15 to 16 years of age. At 17, it would be divided and made into tufts, a tradition that was at least present in the 8th century, and it's not uncommon to see later imagery of Prince Umayado when he was younger with this kind of boy's hairstyle. Umayado was certain that the pro-Soga forces would be beaten, and suggested that their only option was prayer. But not prayer to the kami as might have been the case in earlier centuries. Rather, he suggested that they employ a strategy that I'll call Buddha take the wheel. He found a small tree nearby and cut it down to fashion images of the 4 heavenly kings, or the Shitenno. He then placed the images in his own hair for reasons I can't quite entirely understand, and then he uttered a vow. He said if the Soga forces won the day, then Prince Umayado would erect a temple with a pagoda to give thanks for the Buddha's assistance. Interestingly enough, it seems that Umayado was not the only member of the Soga family who thought that they could do with a little divine intervention. Umiko also made his own prayer to the heavenly kings, as well as to the Great Spirit King, who's sometimes identified with Daikoku. He asked for the protection, and, much as Umayado had done, Umiko said that if they won, then he too would erect a temple with a pagoda in their honor. Additionally, he offered to propagate the three precious things everywhere, or at least everywhere in the archipelago. With both of these vows made and the heavenly figures of Buddhism properly assuaged, the pro Soga forces once again engaged the entrenched Mononobe. This time, as they were fighting, an arrow flew out from the bow of none other than Tomino Obito no Ichii. That was the same Toneri who caught and slew Nakatomi no Katsumi after he killed Prince Hikobito. Ichii's arrow knocked Mononobe no Moriya off his branch, and Moriya and his children were soon slain. Their leader dead, Moriya's troops finally broke. They ran off and hid wherever they could. Men of rank who fought for Moriya dressed themselves as though they were only servants, and they claimed that they were just out hunting on the Magari Plain in Hirose. Honest. Other children of Moriya's relatives escaped and hid on the plains of Ashihara, where they enacted their own crude witness protection program, changing their personal names as well as their surnames. Others fled and were never found, making a pretty clean escape. And with that, the power of the Mononobe was broken, and it would never fully recover. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were still a powerful court family, and the name Mononobe continues to show up in the records, but the Nihon Shoki no longer records a Mononobe as Omuraji, it would seem. In fact, there doesn't really seem to be anyone made Omuraji in the Nihon Shoki after this incident. The Sendai Kuji Hongi, however, does seem to indicate that there were Mononobe no Omuraji after this point. That suggests to me that either Omuraji was more just the head of the family of any Muraji level family, or perhaps that the Mononobe maintained a little more power than is otherwise thought. Either way, their influence in court was greatly diminished from their previous position. In the aftermath of all of this, there were several things that happened. Of perhaps least significance, though still an interesting sign that the patriarchy loves to find a woman to blame, the Nihon Shoki regurgitates rumors that some people were claiming this whole episode was orchestrated by none other than Soguna Umiko's wife, the younger sister of Mononobe no Moriya. Apparently, she urged Umiko into all of this, they said, claiming that Moriya's death was unjust and unnecessary. While they very well could be correct about that latter bit, after all, there's very little hard evidence, and it was the victors writing the history. Well, blaming it all on Moriya's younger sister seems to be stretching things more than just a little. There were far too many reasons for Umiko and Kashikiya Hime to be acting on their own, and no evidence that Umiko's wife was very much involved in any of it. More significant, perhaps, was the entry saying that there was a temple built dedicated to the four heavenly kings, or Shitenno, in the land of Setsu, which sat between Kawachi and Harima, and includes much of modern Osaka. Half of Moriya's enslaved people, as well as all of his household, were given to this temple. His own house became a farmhouse and was also given, likely indicating that the revenues off the old Mononobe lands were now dedicated to this temple's upkeep. I believe this is supposed to be the famous Shitennoji, believed to have actually been built in 593, though there is some reason to doubt the whole story. After all, this is too early for the founding of that Shitennoji, unless it just happened much later, and we'll cover that at a later time. There's also the problem that this story sounds suspiciously like one from the continent. There, the story happened much later, in the late 7th century, according to the Samguk-yusa, and it was Shilla against the Tang dynasty. Supposedly worshipping the four heavenly kings, the Shitenno helped defend Shilla against the Tang, and it may be that this story was repurposed here, possibly even making it into temple records. After all, there was a lot of Shilla influence in the Naniwa region, and it would be understandable if a temple like Shitennoji claimed a connection with the famous Prince Shotoku, using a Shilla story retold in the context of a Japanese victory. Besides, Umayado was little more than 15 or 16 at the time all this went down, so I do truly wonder at how miraculously precocious he seems to be. There's another story there, one about Sogono Umeko making his Buddhist vows and eventually building Hokoji, aka Asukadera, which to me seems much more plausible. Como points out, however, that later divisions seem to form around the Baekje and Shilla immigrant lineage groups, and the Soga, for the most part, appear to be allied with the Baekje more so than the Shilla, but it was the Shilla immigrant groups who later dominated, driven in part by activity on the mainland. If Komo's theory bears out, then it would be understandable for there to be a Shotoku story linked to a temple for Shilla immigrants, while the Sogono Umeko story might be more linked with the Baekje related immigrant families. But we can go over that in more detail later, I suspect. Another outcome of this whole thing was that Tomi no Obito no Ichi, the Toneri that ended up killing both Nakatomi no Katsumi and Mononobe no Moriya, he was granted, we are told, some 10,000 shiro of rice land. This probably just means that he was given a lot, as 10,000 is often just a euphemism for a metric boatload of something. But if it was real, it might have been something like 15 million acres of land. That would be roughly the size of West Virginia. I suspect it was either an exaggeration, or else the unit of land they used wasn't a shiro per the modern measurements that I've found. Indeed, it was not uncommon for ancient measurements to be slightly off from what we know them to be today. With Moriya dead and his lands and wealth parceled out, one might think that everything was hunky-dory, but there is one more story to all of this. The story of Totoribe no Yorodzu. Yorodzu was a dependent of Moriya, and when everything went down, he and about 100 men were standing guard at Moriya's residence in Naniwa. When he heard about Moriya's death, he decided to leg it, and he hopped on a horse and rode as quickly as he could down to Arimaka in the district of Chinu, where he then hid out in the hills. The court immediately assumed Yorodzu must be planning something and accused him of having traitorous feelings. And on that assumption, they ordered Yorodzu's entire family be put to death. With his family in mortal danger, Yorodzu came out of the hills to face the court-appointed troops. His clothes were tattered, and he had a sword, a bow, and a quiver full of arrows. If they remade this into a movie today, he'd probably wear camouflage face paint and a red bandana. The court officials had soldiers surround him, but he acted as though he was afraid, and he hid from them in a thicket of bamboo. And here's where things get really interesting. Yorodzu knew the hills, and he had prepared for the officials. The thicket he had escaped to wasn't just any grove. He had rigged it, almost like some wushu movie, tying various bamboo together so that he could shake it and make people on the outside think he was in one place or another, disguising his position. From there, he shot his arrows at the soldiers, and not a single one missed. Confused and unsure of where he was, the soldiers hesitated to approach the grove, which gave Yorodzu time to unstring his bow and run off further into the hills. The soldiers tried to pursue, shooting their own arrows at the fleeing man, but they inevitably missed. However, some of them were rather spry. One was even able to get ahead of Yorodzu. This Barry Allen of the Yamato court went prone in a riverbank and took careful aim, shooting Yorodzu as he approached, wounding him in the knee. Wounded, Yorodzu reached down and pulled out his knee arrow, restrung his bow, and started firing again. I like to think that his first shot was to fire his knee arrow back at Barry Allen, but that's just my own headcanon. Taking a break from his sharpshooting, Yorodzu yelled out loudly that he'd been accused without examination. He'd never had any kind of a trial. He would have defended the sovereign, he claimed, and devoted himself to service, but instead the court had come after him. All he wanted to know was whether or not they would take him as a prisoner so he could speak his piece, or were they just there to kill him? His answer came in a hailstorm of arrows, all of which Yorodzu deflected or avoided. He then ended up killing more than 30 of his assailants with his own shots. At last he realized he couldn't go on any longer. He took out his sword and he chopped up his bow so that nobody would capture it. Then he bent his sword and threw it into the river. Finally, he took out his own dagger and stabbed himself in the throat, taking his own life. This wasn't enough for the court, however. Nope, no honorable way out for him. And so when they heard what had happened, they ordered that Yorodzu's own body be chopped up and each piece taken to one of the 8 provinces. However, as the local governor prepared to carry out this order, suddenly the heavens opened with a thunderous crack and rain began to fall. This suggested that maybe something was up. When the rain cleared, people saw the strangest thing. Now, apparently, Yorozu had kept a white dog with him, even in the hills, and the dog had been hanging out near Yorozu's corpse ever since he had died. It would look up, occasionally howling by the corpse. Finally, the dog took Yorozu's head and carried it to an existing kofun, where it placed the head and then stood watch at the entrance. The loyal dog lay down nearby, refused to eat, eventually starving to death in front of the tomb of his master. When word of this reached the court, it touched even the hardest of hearts, and so a new order was issued. They would allow Yorozu's family to construct a tomb and bury his remains. And so they built a tomb in the village of Arimaka and buried Yorozu along with his loyal dog. And with that, we can close this chapter on the conflict of the Mononobe and the Soga. It had been born out of the succession disputes, fueled by the conflicts between Buddhism and local religious practice, and eventually broke out into all-out war between various factions. There was probably a lot more that just never made it into the history books, and so we may never know the full extent of it. At the same time, it was fertile ground for the chroniclers to build up the myths around some of the most legendary figures of the day, including the famous Prince Umayado, or, known to us, as Shotoku Taishi. Fact and fiction intermingle, but even through all of that, I think we can still see the scale of the conflict that occurred here. Next episode, we can look at just who did come to the throne and what happened next. Till then, thank you all for listening and for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have more information on how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/sengokudaimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. And that's all for now. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.